Hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Today sees the first project in what is going to become an ongoing series throughout this year. Last year I did two series of projects, one which was based on colour palettes, one that was based on an inspirational word, and I did those every month so that we ended up with 12 projects at the end of the year. I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to be doing this every calendar month, but throughout the course of the year I do intend to keep revisiting what we're doing today. And basically I'm building on the enjoyment that I had with the colour palette last year, and this year I'm following a mood board. As I say, I don't know that I will do 12 of these this year, but if you enjoy this, then do look out, because it will be a regular occurrence throughout the year. Now, for those of you that are not aware of what a mood board is, basically it's a collection of images that you put together that sort of tie in loosely on a theme. And the theme that I have chosen to work on today is winter whites. Each of these are going to be loosely based around a colour, and I've chosen images that sort of fit within that, so that I can work not only with the colours but the textures and the shapes and the ideas that those images suggest to me. Now, I will pop a link down below to my blog where I will put this, so if you want to print it out and work from it, you can do. If you don't want to go and visit there, then just take a little screenshot if you want to as well. But as you can see here, I've taken some images. We've got paper folded snowflakes, we've got some star lanterns here, a beautiful bouquet of flowers with some sort of winter foliage. This image here is of a chair with a furry throw and some beautiful textured cushions and natural fibres. And here is the word winter spelled out with, I'm guessing they're wooden letters, and some little candles and things like that. And I'm taking inspiration from elements throughout this mood board today to create an easy mixed media piece for you. Hopefully along the way I will show you some tips and techniques on why not to be afraid of mixed media, ways of making it work for you, and more importantly, today everything I'm using is stuff that I've already got. I am not going out and buying anything else. I'm using what I've got. Use what you have got. It doesn't have to be the same as what I'm using today at all. Take inspiration from these images here and look through your stash and find a way of using those things that are just sitting there neglected. I'm sure if you're anything like me, you have a room full of materials and just they need using. There's no point having them if they're just going to sit there. So today I'm going to be doing just that. So I'll move this out of the way and I will just quickly run through some of the things that I've gathered together. I've got a lot of products here to use. I won't be using all of them, but I find it easier if I can just gather everything together and I can work from that limited range that I've got with me. So to begin with, I'm going to be using this MDF circle as a base. I picked these up cheaply at a craft fair here in the UK. It's almost 8 inches in diameter. If you don't have something like this, use a piece of mount board, do this in an art journal, do it on a canvas, take just a couple of sheets of normal cardboard, like cereal box cardboard, glue them together to make a firm base, and use that as your starting point. I picked up 10 of these in a craft fair. I need to use them, so that's what I'm using today. Looking at the images that were in the pictures of the mood board, obviously the colours were winter whites, warm whites, so I've chosen some things that have got texture. This is some paper. I have no idea what it's actually for. It has these little circles punched out of it. I picked that up in my local scrap store for pennies. I picked up several sheets. It's a nice texture. I have some handmade paper here, some more handmade paper here with a honeycomb design. Several paper doilies. These are all sort of inspired by this paper snowflake image here, and also the lacy design on these little lanterns. Continuing from that, I've picked some fabrics. I've got some natural burlap, two different ones there. I've got a finer grain ribbon and a looser fabric, because in this image here, this looks like a sort of natural Hessian linen type fabric on the cushion, so I've brought that along. I've got some lace, some crocheted lace, some slightly more fancy embroidered lace. This trim here, might be using some of that. Another little crocheted lace, and I've got this natural sisal fibre. Might use a bit of that, don't know yet. As I say, I do not need to use all of this, but I've just gathered it here, so I've got it. I've chosen some smaller embellishments. So we've got some flowers, because there was the little bouquet of flowers there. Also going with the sort of natural sort of materials that were showing in the pictures. Got these little miniature wood slices. There's some natural linen cord here. I've got some wooden stars and snowflakes. The word winter made out of wooden letters, because of course the word is there. Don't have to use it, but I've got them, so I've brought them to my table. I've also got some just some sort of texture. So we've got some little pearl balls there, some crystal dewdrops, some little sparkly gems, and then a selection of other small embellishments. There's some metal charms, beads, resin flowers, some buttons, little bits and pieces that will be nice just to add detail. I've got a couple of frames that I may or may not use, not sure yet, but I've gathered them together because they fit with the theme. Just moving on to the other side, I've gathered a couple of stencils because I think I might want to put some detail into my background. Now these stencils are old stencils. I highly doubt that they are available. This one for sure not available. It was by Imagination Crafts. They don't exist anymore. But I've chosen stars. I've chosen this design, which is a Crafter's Workshop stencil, because it reminded me of that little snowflake design. But again, use what you've got. You could use circles, you could use stars, you could use flowers. If you've got a punch, you could punch a shape out of cardboard and make your own stencil. Don't think you need to have these products. This is just using what you've got, being inspired by those images again. I've got a background stamp, which is like a crackle design. This is an Impression Obsession one. Creates this sort of all over crackle. Might use that for a bit of background design. Got some word stickers, Tim Holtz word stickers, may or may not be using those. A couple of inks in sort of neutral colours again, just to fit with the colour palette. And then I sort of got basics. So I've got a decoupage medium, a matte medium, which I'm going to be using to layer the paper on with. I've also got a heavy gel medium for sticking the bulkier embellishments on. And I've got a modelling paste, not sure whether I'm going to use that. I could use that through the stencil, I could just palette that on, I might do. White gesso, always a good starting point for a lot of things, so I have that. Couple of other things, so I've got some paint, again, just what I've got really. This one is a chalk paint for glass, but it's a nice neutral colour. These are just an acrylic, again in a neutral colour. And this is a metallic one, which I thought I might just add a little bit of sparkle. I've also got a Lindy's spray for a bit of shimmer possibly. Again, neutral colour that fits in with the colour scheme. I have got my Distress Resist spray, which I may or may not use. I thought I'd pull it out. Haven't used it for a long time, so I'll see if I can fit that in, because this is all about using up things that have just been sat there for ages. And that's about it really. I have other things in the room obviously, but I'm going to stick with what I've got here. I'm sure I've got plenty to be going on with. And then I've got things like a paint palette and a paintbrush, some water. I've got my heat tool for speeding up drying of layers in between, but I'm just really going to have a go at creating something inspired by this series of images here. Now to begin with, I'm going to give my MDF a coat of gesso, just a good starting point. MDF is absorbent and it'll just make it white. It'll stop some of the glue from soaking straight in, so it should make it easier to stick things down. And then I can begin by building my mixed media piece. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to begin by collaging some of the papers on. I always find a simple rule to follow if you're a little bit unsure on where to go with mixed media, how to get started, is building your layers. Start with the flattest things first, which in this case will be some of these papers, and then gradually build up to things with more texture. So after I've put these on, and I might then sort of stencil a little design or stamp a design, I'll think about adding the burlap and the lace and the crochet, and then move on to more bulkier items such as the wooden embellishments and the flowers and things like that. So whatever's flattest will be the easiest to stick onto here. So today that's going to be some of these papers. And I'm going to tear some random bits and layer them over the surface. And we can trim any overhanging edges off afterwards. So I'm just going to tear a couple of pieces and then arrange them until I'm happy with how the layout is. Just positioning them where I think they might look nice. I think I'm probably going to be happy with the layout along those lines. As I say, it doesn't really matter. Don't overthink it too much, because this again, it's lower layers, it's bottom layers. By the time you've built up your design and put a feature on it, it'll become immaterial really whether you'd position something here or there. But as long as it's a reasonably balanced layout, that's all that matters. So I'm going to take my decoupage medium . And I've got a paintbrush, and I'm just going to apply some of the medium onto the surface so that I can stick these layers down. This dries clear and it dries matte, so don't worry if there's any showing around the edges, you won't see it once it's dry. And I find it just helps pop some down on the surface, stick the layer down, and then just go over the top with a little more, and that just helps flatten it all down and stick it to the base. I'm quite happy with how those have gone down. I'm going to place one of these paper doilies on now, just deciding which one I think I want to use. And I think I'm actually going to use those two white ones there. So again, popping a little bit more the decoupage medium down. So I'm going to dry that off with my heat tool, and then I can trim around the edges, and then we can move on to adding some detail to this with some stamping and stenciling. Now that this is dry, I want to apply a little bit of paint to the background and using my stencils. And I'm going to begin by using this one here, which is sort of like a stylized flower. It's almost oriental flower. This is just some sponge that I've just cut up, some old sponge. And I'm going to be using some of these paints today. So this is an Americana paint. It's called Driftwood. It's just a sort of neutral, warm brown colour. I'm going to pop some in my palette. Also going to use a little of this timeless chalk paint. Pop a bit of that in my palette. And I might be using this one as well. This one's Pebble. So again, just pop a bit of that in there and I've got them. I'm not going to be using the gold just yet. That's something that I might use on some of the embellishments, I think. So I say I've got this sponge. Just going to dab a bit of paint onto my sponge and use it through the stencil. Just going to give that a quick blast with the heat tool to dry it off a bit, and then I'm going to use the star stencil. I'm happy with that for now, and I'm going to move on to adding some colour with the inks that I've got here. And for this, I am going to reuse some of the stencils. So obviously, if you've used paint on your stencil, rinse it off before coming in with your inks. So I'm going to be using Antique Linen Distress Oxide and Frayed Burlap Distress Oxide, and I'm just using one of the blending brushes. Just building up another layer on the background here. And I'm just going to take my stamp. I'm not going to pop it on a block because I don't want to stamp the entire of the image. I'm just using a very pale grey. This is Shadow Grey archival ink. Just going to apply some ink onto the stamp. And randomly press down onto the surface. Just going to get some partial stamping. It's going to be very subtle. The background has some texture to it, and we're just lightly pressing on in certain areas. And there, if you take a closer look, you can just see we've got the hint of some crackle there. Just a little bit of extra interest added onto that background. One thing I do think I want to do is just apply a little of this grey ink around the edge. Just to frame it. Now we can begin to move on to some of our heavier layers, the more bulky ones. And the next thing I'm going to go for is some of these fabrics, the laces and burlaps and crochet trim. So in my mind, I have an idea of a sort of layout that I want. I want a focal image to be sort of here, and then almost like a strip that comes across, possibly almost like a cross shape, but I want it to be an off-center focal image. So trying to decide, obviously not going to put all of these things on. I quite like this burlap ribbon that I've got, and thought that might be quite nice to have cut in a strip across. Again, we can trim off any excess if we want to. I very much like this, but I'm not sure whether how to go about using it. I'm wondering whether to actually cut out one of the floral elements that's on the crochet trim. Yeah, quite like that. Just wondering, I might cut out one of the smaller flowers as well. Just carefully snipping around the design. I think this one might be a little bulky. So again, just sort of keeping in mind how I'm thinking of my finished layout. I think that might be the sort of general way I want these fabric trims putting down. So I'm going to use my heavy gel medium to stick these down. An all-purpose glue will do the job just fine. As I say, I'm just using what I have here. So just popping a little of that in a palette so that I can use a brush to put it on. So now that that's dry, pretty much dry, there's a few places where it's still a little bit tacky, but it's dry enough for me to continue. Before I put any more embellishments on, I want to use some of the Lindy's Starburst spray. This is the Steampunk Sepia, sort of a neutral beige brown colour. And I just want to spray a little onto here and onto the flowers that I've got. So I chose a couple of flowers earlier. These two are paper, this one's fabric. But I want to just add a little of the Lindy's spray to those and onto this base. So just got a box. I always use, it's an old cardboard drawer and it's what I use for spraying, just to catch the overspray. So giving the spray a good shake up. Some on there. And I'm going to try to avoid getting it, unsuccessfully avoid getting it on my hands. Just adds a little extra colour, and there should be a bit of shimmer when it's dry as well. So we just need to set those aside to dry, or so you can give some of it a bit of a blast with the heat tool. I wouldn't recommend it on the fabric flower. I have a feeling that they're made out of a polyester type fabric, so it may shrivel with the heat. But once this is dry, I can come back and start assembling some of our more bulky embellishments, create a focal point on the board. So the spray has dried and there is a subtle shimmer. It's difficult to catch on the camera here. I do want to highlight a little of the texture we've got. So I'm just going to use some white gilding wax. This is a metallic luster. Get some on my fingers and brush it over some of the areas that have got a little texture, just to add a bit more highlight. So finally we get to move on, as I said, to some of these, the more bulky embellishments that we put together earlier on. And we can kind of start to look at how we want the finished piece to feel. So we just play around with some ideas for layouts at this point. A good tip if you get to the point where you're happy with how you've positioned things, take a photograph before you move it all apart again, because it can be tricky to remember how you put everything in the first place. So I want to use this MDF snowflake. I don't like this little hanging loop on the top, so I'm just going to cut that off with my craft knife. So there, that's better. So I'm thinking this is a good start for how I want to be. I'm going to be putting some of the smaller things, the little wooden slices, and some of the gems and pearl balls as well. But this is the larger elements. So I'm going to go ahead and stick these down. For some the MDF and the wooden ones, I'm going to use the gel medium. For the flowers, I'm actually going to use my hot glue gun because they're quite bulky and it'll be easier to stick them down with that. So I'm going to go away and get those stuck in place, and then I'll come back and we'll add some detail with some paint and add the smaller finishing touches. So the bulkier embellishments are glued in place. I have added some of those little wooden slices as well. So I'm going to use a little paint to highlight some detail on the frame, and I think on that star there. Not sure, maybe onto the wooden letters as well. And then I'm going to be adding in some of these smaller little pearl balls and possibly some clear dewdrops or gems. So I'm just going to take a fine brush, and I want to use some gold paint, but also some white, and because I've got the gesso here, I'm just going to use that. So popping a little white gesso into my palette. I've decided I do want to do the words in white, so I'm just going to paint over the surface of those. Now, you could have done this before. It's not complicated to do it now that they're in place. They're raised up, so I'm not concerned about getting paint over the surrounding area. And sometimes you kind of have to get everything in place to see whether you need to adjust the balance of colour. And I just wanted to bring these out a little whiter. So happy with that. I'm also going to pop just a little white gesso on this frame before I add some gold paint. Because it's a resin, it's quite a slick surface for paint to grip onto, and the gesso just provides it with a good base. So not fussed about, you know, a decent all over coat, just sort of brushing it loosely, because that's what I'm going to do with the gold paint anyway. And say hopefully it'll just provide a bit better tooth for the acrylic paint to grip onto. I think I'm just going to lightly brush a little white over the top of this darker flower here, just to bring out the shape of the petals a little more and just tone that colour down. And I want to put gold paint onto this star. I think it might be nice just to add a little patchy white on there first. Again, this is the sort of thing that you kind of make up as you go along, really. Just these finishing touches to make a nice balance of colour. And again, I might just dry brush a little paint onto this snowflake here. Possibly mix a little of this acrylic that I've got in the palette from earlier, just to make an off-white colour. And I'm going to use some of this metallic gold. Again, just popping some into my palette ready to use with this fine brush. And that's just adding a nice little subtle metallic sheen to some of these embellishments here. Going to take a little paint, thin it down with some water, and then just tap my brush to create a few splatters in the background. And that just creates a very fine mist that'll just again add a subtle sparkle. So finally I'm going to use these little smaller pearl balls and a couple of these clear dewdrop gems, possibly some of these. I don't know, I feel these are lovely little flat back gems, but they're very reflective, and I've already got these sparkle crystals, which I think is enough sparkle. So I'm going to stick with these two. I'm going to use a little gel medium to stick these down. So I've got my paintbrush here still. Just going to dot a bit of gel medium in and add a few of these embellishments, and I shall be back to show you the finished item when it's dry. Here's my finished piece. As you can see, I've added in some of the smaller pearl embellishments and the clear glass dewdrops. I also had a little white gesso left on my palette, so I just dotted it onto the edge of some of these petals just to highlight the texture there. And I used some of the Tim Holtz clipping stickers to add a few more words on the arrangement. Now, if you don't have the clipping stickers, don't rush out and buy them. Get an old book, cut some words out of that and use that. At the end of the day, these are just scans of words and phrases from books, so make your own. Don't feel you've got to rush out and buy any of this stuff. This is all about using what you have. I've pretty much covered everything that was in this mood board. The word here is reflected in our wooden letters that we've used. This image here with the cushions with the different textures and natural fibres. We've got textured handmade papers, we've got burlap, we've got lace. This lovely winter bouquet, we have our flowers, both the fabric and paper and the little resin flowers. The filigree star lanterns at the bottom, again we've got star shapes. We have a wooden star here, and we've got the filigree type designs within the handmade papers. And finally, the main image here with these paper snowflakes. Of course, we've used paper. We've got an MDF snowflake here. We've used little pearls and gems that are reflected in the confetti that's on the table behind there. The little wooden slices, again, natural materials. There's pine cones, there's wooden table. So I think we've pretty much covered everything that is there to inspire us within that mood board. I hope that you found it as a straightforward tutorial. Again, always start off with the thinner, flatter layers and work your way up to the more bulky embellishments towards the end. You can't really go wrong if you do it that way. And I hope that you found a way to maybe use some of those products that you've had sitting around for a long time, wondered how to combine them together, and a mood board is certainly a really good starting point for that. So if you enjoyed this video, as always, please leave me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. There will be more mood boards coming throughout the course of the year, and I will compile those into a list, a playlist, so that you'll be able to find them all quite easily. But for now, that's all. So goodbye.